Hey guys, how's everybody doing? Um, Still trying to get the live stream set up here a little bit better. I'll probably get something to hold the phone on soon and stuff like that. But I actually kind of enjoy the chill setup. Just waiting for people to hop on. I should remind everybody that it's super helpful if you hit with a donation during these. That would be awesome. And of course, the best move is to become a Patreon. That's how the whole thing happens. You can just click the super chat. That's how you do it. Is the echo really that bad? I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. This is like the chill version of these things. So maybe I'll answer a few questions later, but I actually did want to talk basically about stuff having to do with my book. Of course, the book is coming out this fall from Zero Books. It's called, the working title is Against the Web, the Cosmopolitan Socialist Answer to the IDW and the New Right. And what I'm trying to do in this book is a variety of things. I definitely want to debunk and deal with and historicize and critique the arguments put forward by the likes of Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson and the rest of the gang. Obviously, there's some fun to be had with Dave Rubin. Transcribing Dave Rubin's UPS conversation with Joe Rogan was fucking hilarious. I was like, just incredible. I can't wait for people to read that and then immediately YouTube it and rewatch it again. That should be played all the time. And then to articulate this answer of cosmopolitan socialism, which to me is really important because cosmopolitan socialism is a globalized version of solidarity-driven Marxist leftist politics, right? So it says it is about a common struggle. It is about building common bonds, but we have to root those common bonds in global sources. So saying universal struggle cannot just be a replication of sort of the default white American, European, so on. But on the other hand, it can't be atomized and split, particularly not in like the direction of the vampire castle, right? Which is Mark Fisher's amazing essay on really the toxicity of a lot of the modern left that people absolutely urgently not only need to read, but act on and deal with all of the really serious problems and pathologies he identified. So that's the sort of dual mission of it. And what I want to talk about tonight a little bit is the ideas of something called integral theory, and then Marx, and then how it relates to this book. So integral theory is mainly kind of known as something that actually in one variety is sort of like a spiritual idea, a spiritual tradition. And part of, I think, some of the things that my work will be kind of doing over the next couple of months is having more and more of this conversation of, is there a spirituality that is relevant to the left? And obviously, in that sense, it can't rest on sort of metaphysical assumptions in a way, but it can give us, I see the orb. I'm definitely talking more Cornel West than Marianne Williamson, and I'm definitely talking liberation theology. I'm definitely talking some currents in Buddhism. But integral theory is, and there's a variety of people working on this. As an example, Jeremy Johnson, who's brilliant. We did a primer on integral theory for patrons, and he has a book that he's written on a guy named Gene Gebser, who was one of the most important integral theorists historically. Then there's a guy named William Irwin Thompson, who was an interesting theorist. Sri Aurobindo, who was an Indian independence fighter and philosopher, was an integral theory. And then kind of most sort of famously, Ken Wilber, at least in a modern American context. And Ken Wilber is a really interesting writer. He had a great theoretical model in some ways. I should say he does. Unfortunately, his writings, when he's tried to apply his model to different areas of social concern, I mean, he usually ended up in kind of a mess because, just areas like politics, he just has a very limited information base on. And he sort of just, replicated kind of mediocre conventional wisdom. And I would say in some ways he's IDW adjacent, although his theory is a lot more interesting than a Jordan Peterson's, as an example. I wish that people, even for all of his many, many flaws and weaknesses, were reading somebody, and kind of some of the sort of New Age stuff, were reading Ken Wilber instead of Jordan Peterson. So in Ken Wilber's model, one of the things that I find really helpful is this idea of the quadrant. And this quadrant model says that on the right side of the quadrant are systems that are objective. So, and then on the on the lower half, I believe, is the individual, and then on the upper half is the social. And on the left side, there's subjective, and then it also goes individual and social. So one example could be on an individual level, if somebody was dealing with, say, something like depression, that would be maybe configured of in some ways as an individual challenge, although we know from Johann Hari's work it very much is not, and a kind of broader integral answer to something like depression would include social, political, ecological dimensions. That actually is integral thinking. But you could say on one side, if we were keeping this narrow analogy, one side of the dimension would be looking subjectively. What's happening with somebody's brain chemistry? What is their nutrition like? What is their physiology like? How is that affecting their mental health, right? Then on the flip side, there's a whole bunch of really important subjective questions. What is their day-to-day experience in life? Does their life have meaning? Does their life have purpose? Are they, how are they actually doing in their lives? And then you can go on to argue that there's a similar corollary socially, right? So like we live in a, quote, free market capitalist society, right? And there's all sorts of regulatory and institutional realities. There's deregulation, there's liberalizing the economy, so-called liberalizing the economy. There's writing rules and bureaucracies that favor, the wealthy, that favor corporations, that allow companies to, use the state in very restrictive ways when it comes to things like their intellectual property, but in totally lax ways when it comes to, the environment or workers or something like that. And then on the flip side, there's a mythology, there's a story of the free market. There's a story of, the self-made man, as an example. So there's things are always correlating. And this is true of everything. Good, bad, east, west, north, south. There's this integral mode. And I actually find that really, Mark Fisher's writing on depression is excellent. I should add that as well. So one of the things that you can start to see when you get to the IDW is that on one hand, they are able to, they have open terrain because there's weaknesses in the sort of pop culture left that they can run through, right? And that's the sort of like Vampire Castle, outrage culture stuff. That's some of the things that Ben Burgess definitely identifies and give them an argument. And then there's also, on the flip side, of course, just people who are desperate for a reorientation and recreation of traditional class, gender, and race-based hierarchies, which is what the IDW fundamentally usually speaks to. But they've had a lot of room to grow because of some of the serious limitations in some parts of left discourse. And then we can see that there, and so the way this relates to Wilbur is that Wilbur actually also had a critique of of a certain type of postmodern discourse, but the idea was that you would transcend it through synthesis versus rejecting its insights. So that's one of the things I'm trying to do with Cosmopolitan Socialism. As an example, I used in the last time, and I know I'm covering a lot of ground here, but I used in the last video I did on this, Amartya Sen, who's a very big influence on me, and he actually, I would say in a lot of ways it is an update of internationalism, yes. So Amartya Sen critiqued autocrats in the 1990s who ran countries like Singapore and Malaysia. And these leaders would use the rhetoric of quote unquote Asian values to suggest that when, as an example, they censored newspapers or put political opponents in jail, they weren't in any way violating human rights. What they were doing was observing Asian group values. And then on the other hand, you know, obviously, and very much ascendant in the 90s, you had you know, this notion that like, no, there is global values, global human rights, global standards, and those standards come from the West, right? The classic, first of all, historically illiterate, there's no such thing as the West, there's no historical continuity. And then, you know, the innate bigotry of that. So the argument that Sen made was that, in fact, we don't have to go in either of these directions. There are universal aspirations for rights and values, and they're universal because they're expressed in every single culture on earth. So we can root our values and our politics across the globe. That's something I try to do to the extent as humanly possible on my show. I want people to know that, as an example, you know, reading Cabral is in, you know, nothing more relevant than, you know, for centering our politics and understanding history, class, and economics. So what the IDW has done is they've taken this very narrow critique, which they can score kind of pop culture points on, and then they've, you know, expanded it to creating their own grievance-driven echo chamber, where they go over the same controversies again and again. They, of course, hilariously, they constantly whine when they're criticized. That's what this, you know, hysterically, you know, watching Eric Weinstein be upset that Dave Rubin gets critiqued is, I mean, it's hysterical. And it really shows the ball, right? It shows the ball that this is not a, you know, movement of openness. It's a movement of grievance. It's important to respond to these guys, though, because, again, partially they identify some areas where we can be weak, but also because, especially in Jordan Peterson's case, he's dealing with lack of meaning and alienation, and then he's giving a reactionary answer to it. That's why, in some ways, in writing the book, dealing argument by argument, Harris is the one that requires the most precision. But the themes that Peterson identifies are the most long-lasting. And I would argue that all of them, even when the IDW disappears, you know, are going to set the template for the right-wing arguments, the new versions of right-wing arguments that we're dealing with for the rest of our lives. So, at any rate, that's why you know, Peterson is so important, and that's why I do think that the left cannot shy away from conversations about meaning, purpose, and also recognize that the demographics and the groups that he talks to, frankly, of like those young white men, if you look at Scott Atran's work on purpose making and understanding groups like ISIS, we recognize that these are incredibly dangerous, potentially alienated people that we absolutely need to address and have a strategy for. And the reason, though, that I want to put Marx in is because I think that Marx, in addition to understanding power, in addition to flipping the notion that profit isn't some organic thing. Profit is your stolen labor power turned into an excess for a capitalist. I love that. Primitive accumulation. How did capitalism actually start? What was the foundation of it, right? These are really important, vital. But you can also take concepts and ideas like alienation, the disconnect from the output of your own labor, the really, if you get down to it, the notion that people don't have governance and power over their own economic lives, is also, if you want to use a spiritual problem. It's a meaning problem. You know, when you look even at an example like Mondragon Corporation in Spain, which Professor Richard Wolff uses a lot, or other cooperative efforts like CoOps as an example, you totally see that people who have more power in their corporation, more power in their business life, in their economic life, which obviously we know that private enterprise is the least democratic sphere in so-called democratic societies, that the ability to have that power over your economic life helps transcend some of that alienation and generate meaning and purpose. And this to me loops back to the quadrant, because what we can start to do if we don't shy away from questions of meaning and purpose is, one, generate our own discourses on things like spirituality, things like generating existential meaning. And then we can sync them up with the reality that not only should you not just sort of like worry about quote unquote cleaning your room and fitting into a system that does not work for you and most people, but that in fact alienation from your own economic life is a profoundly important existential and spiritual question. And we can start to come with our own materially grounded integral framework. That's a problem. A lot of integral ideas are fascinating, but they're not materially grounded. Marx, grounds us in the day-to-day, the ground of our life, right? So, and of course it all matters, right? This is why Gramsci is so important. Gramsci really connected institutions with ideology, with material drives. But especially in the United States, where we are so disconnected from understanding class, from understanding economics, and so many people, whether they are New Age philosophers or Sam Harris for that matter, really walk around thinking and promoting the idea that human beings think something and then they do things, versus our bodies, we do and are acted upon all day in our economic lives. And that filters up into how we think and how we conceive of the world. So, at any rate, guys, I know that's a lot. I hope it made some sense. I promise it will be clear in the book, but I am fascinated by this stuff, and I want to give you guys a sense of the flow of how this stuff, is going to look, and how it's going to go. If right-wing Mandela debated Nation of Islam Obama, that would be an interesting debate. See, like, where does logic come from? It's like, comes from these nuts, motherfucker. All right. So stupid. So, let's see. As suggested readings, I would definitely read Mark Fisher's Vampire Castle essay. I do think people should check out, read I'll Find It. Jeremy Johnson has a great book on Gene Gebser, and I really like Jeremy Johnson's work. I think people should check out a little bit of Ken Wilber, so I would read The Marriage of Sense and Soul, Integrating Science and Religion. Again, Wilber, I endorse Wilber with a huge amount of caveats, but I do think that model, that quadrant model, is interesting. Beta. In other news, guys, I believe tomorrow I'm going clean shaven. I think I'm riding out the rest of the summer with a clean shave. So just letting you guys know. I do wash my face with soap. It's very hot in here. All right, guys. Yeah, I think it's time. I think it's time for the clean shave. All right. I appreciate all of you. Thanks so much. Patreon.com/TMBS, and spread the word. If you're just stopping by, click subscribe. Peace out, guys.